Welcome viewer for turning into First News Broadcast TV channel where we dispense helpful to political and global awareness on both formers and current affairs, building community news revolutionary commitment of our world. All right, we move on to latest breaking news. Trump v. Biden latest. Disaster for Ukraine and Europe. Concerns over Trump's VP pick as comments about UK resurface. Donald Trump received rapturous applause at the Republican National Convention after naming his running mate as JD Vance, a populist who opposes Ukraine aid and who called the UK the first Islamist country to get a nuclear weapon. Listen to a daily podcast on U.S. politics as you follow us along. Trump arrives at Republican National Convention. Donald Trump made a jubilant return to the spotlight yesterday after surviving an attempt on his life by gunman Thomas Matthew Crooks on Saturday. He smiled, waved, and pumped his fist as walked into an arena in Milwaukee to huge cheers and applause, his ear heavily bandaged from being hit by a bullet. Trump names his running mate. Wow. Donald Trump has named Ohio Senator JD Vance as his running mate for the presidential election. This means that if Trump is elected this November, Mr. Vance will become vice president. Trump said he made the decision after lengthy deliberation and thought, and considering the tremendous talents of many others. Posting on Truth Social, he wrote, JD honorably served our country in the Marine Corps, graduated from Ohio State University in 2 years summa cum laude, and is a Yale Law School graduate, where he was editor of the Yale Law Journal and president of the Yale Law Veterans Association. He continued, JD has had a very successful business career in technology and finance, and now, during the campaign, will be strongly focused on the people he fought so brilliantly for. Trump added, as vice president, JD will continue to fight for our Constitution, stand with our troops, and will do everything he can to help me make America great again. The U.S. Marines veteran once described himself as a never-Trumper, but has since become a reliable supporter, even attending court in New York to support Trump at his hush money trial. Mr. Vance is aligned with Trump's populist mindset and will likely be palatable to the MAGA base, perhaps even as a potential successor one day. Disaster for Ukraine. Trump's VP pick is against U.S. aid. As we've been reporting, Donald Trump has chosen JD Vance as his vice presidential nominee in his bid to return to the White House. Mr. Vance is aligned with Donald Trump's populist mindset and will likely be palatable to his base, perhaps even as a potential successor one day. But as one of the most isolationist members of the Republican Party, his appointment is seen by some as a worrying move for Europe. Mr. Vance has been vocal in his opposition to U.S. support for Ukraine and played a key role in trying to scrap the long-delayed security bill, which included a $60 billion military aid package for Kyiv. One senior European Union official told Politico that the Ohio senator's pick as running mate spelt disaster for Ukraine and, by extension, for the EU. At the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, Mr. Vance skipped a meeting with top Ukrainian officials and told a European audience that the U.S. should reassess its support for Ukraine. He also criticized what he said was Europe's overdependence on Washington for security, as well as saying he did not believe Vladimir Putin posed an existential threat to the continent. While he doesn't believe the U.S. should pull out of NATO, Mr. Vance has said that the U.S. should focus more on East Asia, which he said will be the future of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. In February, he declined to condemn Mr. Trump for saying he could encourage Mr. Putin to attack America's NATO allies if they failed to increase their defense spending. Trump's VP nominee pick signals significant shift in U.S. foreign policy if they win. By Deborah Haynes, security and defense editor. The choice of JD Vance, an arch critic of U.S. aid to Ukraine and of American taxpayers bankrolling European security, as Donald Trump's running mate signals a very significant shift in U.S. foreign policy should they win the election. Defense insiders say. The 39-year-old Republican senator, a former Marine and relative political novice, could well be the next vice president of the United States come January. It means his views on foreign affairs, expressed in multiple interviews, articles, and speeches, are being studied with a new intensity. They reveal, in line with his boss, a forceful push to put America first, even at the expense of old alliances, such as the transatlantic NATO bond as well as the West's fight to counter Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Instead, a priority focus is on the threat posed by China and countering Iran. A former senior British defense official predicted that a Trump-Vance White House would lead to the immediate termination of all financial and military aid for Ukraine. A second defense source was less sure, asking whether the pair were really going to strangle Ukraine on their watch. But Mr. Vance, who has opposed multi-billion-dollar packages of assistance to Kyiv, admitted in a 2022 podcast interview with Steve Bannon, a Trump advisor, "I don't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or the other." According to the New York Times. He has also written that the US and Europe lack the industrial production capacity to be able to make the volume of weapons needed for Ukraine to win the war. Instead, Mr. Trump's new running mate advocates a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. In comments that will alarm Kyiv and allies such as London, he has dismissed as fantastical the idea, a core goal of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, that Ukraine will regain all territory seized by Russian forces since the first invasion of Crimea in 2014. By committing to a defensive strategy, Ukraine can preserve its precious military manpower, stop the bleeding, and provide time for negotiations to commence, Mr. Vance wrote in an article for the New York Times in April. It underlines why the prospect of a second Trump presidency, with Mr. Vance as vice president, means huge new anxiety for Ukraine after more than 2.5 years of full-scale war. I do hope that there will be other people in Trump's team, like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who will balance Vance's approach, said Lyudmila Dolanovska, an expert in strategic communications based in Kyiv. If I were an MP or a government official, I would immediately request a meeting with Vance to try to convince him to support Ukraine. It is not just Ukraine that should be worried about the impact of Mr. Vance on the future shape of U.S. foreign policy. Reuters. The UK and European NATO allies should be planning in earnest right now for a massive ramping up, at speed, of their own ability to defend themselves and deter threats if a second Trump White House becomes, as predicated, far more isolationist and focused on threats coming from China rather than Russia's threat to Europe. The former senior UK defense official, speaking on condition of anonymity, predicted a second Trump administration would start the process of dismantling NATO. I'm not exaggerating. Writing in the Financial Times in February, Mr. Vance warned the U.S. has provided a blanket of security to Europe for far too long. He was highly critical of how the UK and other European states cut back on defense budgets and slashed the size of their respective armed forces and ability to fight in the wake of the end of the Cold War, instead relying on the protection of the more powerful U.S. military. As the American defense budget nears $1 trillion per year, we ought to view the money Europe hasn't spent on defense for what it really is, an implied tax on the American people to allow for the security of Europe, Mr. Vance wrote. He added, "The question each European nation needs to ask itself is this: are you prepared to defend yourself? And the question the U.S. must ask is, if our European allies can't even defend themselves, are they allies or clients?" Trump would immediately act as Ukraine war peace broker if victorious, Hungarian PM says. Donald Trump is prepared to immediately jump into the role of peace broker in the Ukraine war if he is elected in November, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has said. In a letter to EU leaders, Mr. Orbán said the would-be president will not wait until his inauguration in January to act, saying he had detailed and well-founded plans for a settlement in the conflict which has raged for nearly 2.5 years. Mr. Orbán drafted the letter after meeting with Mr. Trump, a longtime ally of his, as well as the Ukrainian, Russian, and Chinese leaders last week, in what he described as a peace mission. In the letter, he also said Joe Biden was not capable of modifying the current U.S. pro-war policy. The Hungarian leader, unlike most allies, has long been critical of the level of military support provided by Europe for Ukraine. He said Mr. Trump returning to the White House would change the burden between the U.S. and the EU when it comes to financial support for Ukraine. Assassination attempt gives Trump leeway to say almost anything in convention speech. Donald Trump's near-death experience gives him enormous leeway to say almost anything at the Republican National Convention later this week, according to a political strategist. The former president is tempering some of his more aggressive language and had already started to do so before the attempt on his life, Hillary Rosen told Sky News. But while he will likely present himself as a big-picture diplomat, it does not mean there aren't going to be a lot of crazy comments coming out of the convention, she added. The man had a near-death experience, and that will give him enormous leeway to say almost anything, Ms. Rosen said. Trump supporters staunchly oppose gun reforms despite shooting. Donald Trump supporters are still firmly opposed to gun reforms in the U.S., despite the former president narrowly surviving an assassination attempt that involved AR-15-style automatic weapon. Reuters interviewed 12 Trump delegates at his Republican Party convention in Milwaukee, with none advocating for bans or restrictions on assault rifles, raising the legal age to buy a gun, or even stronger background checks. Many deemed even modest measures an infringement on the U.S. Constitution's Second Amendment, which states that Americans have the right to bear arms. The delegates said gun reforms should center around funding better mental health support for people who are troubled, blaming gun crime and mass shootings on mental illness and the wrong people getting hold of weapons. It's all about mental health, said Will Boone, a delegate from Montana. The right to have a gun is enshrined in the Constitution. Once you start infringing on that, you'll start other rights being taken away. Meanwhile, Steve Kramer, from Georgia, said it was a lie that gun issues would be helped by expanded background checks. If you look at most of the killings, someone stole the gun, so background checks wouldn't matter, he said. Very good chance Biden will not be Democrat nominee, strategist says. There is still a very good chance that Joe Biden will not be the Democrat nominee in the U.S. presidential election, a political strategist has said. Hillary Rosen told Sky News she does not believe the president can sustain this for the next couple of months. She said Mr. Biden's interview with Sky's U.S. partner network NBC News showed a significantly weakened president. According to Ms. Rosen, the 18-minute interview with NBC's Lester Holt showed why the Republican Party is desperate for Mr. Biden to stay in the race. Unfortunately, he still doesn't really understand people's concerns with him, and that is a problem not just for Democrats, but for all the independents who may not necessarily agree with Donald Trump and have been looking for a solid alternative, she said. Ms. Rosen added that Mr. Biden keeps talking about the past and bragging on himself. He's not giving voters a vision for the future, and he just spends his time attacking Donald Trump and declaiming any responsibility for the state of this race. That's not what voters want to hear, she said. The president could also see another poll drop after this week's Republican convention, with Donald Trump expected to give a speech on Thursday, Ms. Rosen said. Whether the Democrats can do anything to make that up in their convention is doubtful, she said. Trump took call from Elon Musk day before announcing Vance as running mate. Report. Elon Musk called Donald Trump and urged him to pick JD Vance as his running mate a day before the former president announced the Ohio senator's appointment, according to a report. CNN reports that the billionaire businessman was one of several voices urging Mr. Trump to select Mr. Vance as the deadline approached. The announcement of Mr. Vance as the vice presidential nominee came after lengthy deliberation and thought, Mr. Trump wrote on his Truth Social account last night. Sources told CNN that the final meeting between the two men was held at Mr. Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort on Saturday, hours before he was shot at a rally in Pennsylvania. One source described their discussion as the final interview before getting the job. Mr. Vance left Mr. Trump's residence confident, but unsure if he would definitely be picked, sources said. Explaining his decision on Truth Social yesterday, the former president said Mr. Vance was best suited to the position and will be strongly focused on the people he fought so brilliantly for, the American workers and farmers in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, and far beyond. Trump-Vance administration sounds just right, says Hungarian PM aide. An advisor to Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has welcomed the news that JD Vance has been appointed Donald Trump's running mate. A Trump-Vance administration sounds just right, Balázs Orbán wrote in a post to X congratulating Mr. Vance. The vice presidential nominee has previously shown support for some of Viktor Orbán's nationalist policies, including a change to higher education regulation which gave the government more control over what is taught. Mr. Trump is a longtime ally of the Hungarian leader. The pair met in Florida last week to discuss the possibilities of peace in Ukraine after a major NATO summit in Washington. UK government disagrees with Vance, Islamist country comments. A UK minister has said his government disagrees with JD Vance's view that the UK is the first Islamist country with nuclear weapons, but that the bond between Britain and the US is more important than any individuals. James Murray, Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, was asked by Sky News' Kay Burley whether he was alarmed by Mr. Vance's comments last week, see 7.40 post. He replied that he didn't know what Mr. Vance meant by his remarks, and obviously we disagree on those particular comments that he's made. But the relationship between the UK and the US is more important than any individuals, Mr. Murray added. It's about the relationship between our countries, which goes back so long and which is so important for our security, for our national security and for economic growth. The minister said the government was proud of the UK's diversity, adding, "I don't really know how that comment fits in." Okay, viewers, that is all for now, and thanks for watching First News Broadcast. See you again and stay tuned. Welcome, brethren, for turning into First News Broadcast TV channel, where we dispense helpful to global awareness on current awareness and formers, building community news revolutionary commitment of our world. All right, we move on to the news headline and updates. Please, viewers, if it is your first time on First News Broadcast TV channel, do us a favor to share to your friends and family, like and subscribe. See you again. Thanks for watching.